The wagon wheels had stopped turning 3 days ago. Sarah Mitchell sat in the shade of the broken axle, her hands trembling as she held the last drops of water in her tin cup. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of red rock and thorny brush that seemed to mock her predicament. Her husband John lay fevering under their makeshift shelter, delirious from the infected wound on his leg where the rattlesnake had struck. They had been traveling to California, with dreams of gold and a new life, but now those dreams felt as dried up as the cracked earth beneath their feet. The other wagons in their train had pushed ahead after John's accident, promising to send help back, but Sarah knew help wasn't coming, not in time. She had tried everything she could think of. She'd attempted to fix the wheel herself, but the wooden spokes had splintered beyond repair when they hit that hidden boulder. She'd rationed their water carefully, but the desert sun was merciless. Each day it climbed higher and blazed hotter, stealing moisture from their bodies and hope from their hearts. On the third morning, Sarah made a decision that terrified her. She would have to leave John and walk for help. The nearest settlement was maybe 20 miles south, according to their crude map. She filled her small canteen with the remaining water, kissed her husband's burning forehead, and promised she would return with rescue. The desert was a living thing that seemed determined to defeat her. Rocks cut through her worn boots, thorns caught at her dress, and the sun beat down with relentless fury. By midday, her lips were cracked and bleeding. By afternoon, she was stumbling more than walking. The landscape began to blur and swim before her eyes, and she started to hear things that weren't there, the sound of running water, voices calling her name, the rumble of wagon wheels. As evening approached, Sarah collapsed behind a large boulder, her strength completely gone. She had no idea how far she had walked or in which direction. The desert all looked the same now, an endless maze of red stone and dying vegetation. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but even words seemed too much effort. That's when she heard the real sound, the soft footfall of an unshod horse on rocky ground. Sarah opened her eyes and saw him silhouetted against the darkening sky. He sat tall on his paint horse, a figure carved from shadow and starlight. Even in her fevered state, she could see the long black hair, the strong shoulders, the way he moved with the horse as if they were one creature. He dismounted and approached her slowly, his moccasins making no sound on the desert floor. Sarah tried to speak, to ask for help, but only a whisper came out. He knelt beside her, and she could see his face clearly now. His skin was bronzed by sun and wind, his dark eyes serious but not unkind. He wore simple buckskin clothing and carried a rifle across his back. The Apache warrior, for that's what she knew he must be, studied her for a long moment. Sarah had heard terrible stories about his people, tales that made women clutch their children closer and men reach for their guns. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected: concern. He spoke to her in his own language, words that sounded like wind through canyon walls. When she didn't respond, he tried broken English. "Water," he said, reaching for a leather pouch at his side. He helped her sit up and brought the pouch to her lips. The water was warm, but tasted like life itself. "My husband," Sarah managed to whisper, pointing back in the direction she thought she had come from. "Sick wagon." The Apache nodded, as if he understood. He looked toward the horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. Then he looked back at her, making what seemed to be a difficult decision. Sarah wondered if he was deciding whether to help her or leave her to die. Without warning, he scooped her up in his strong arms as easily as if she were a child. Sarah was too weak to protest, too desperate to care about propriety or the stories she had heard. He placed her on his horse and swung up behind her, his arms creating a protective circle as he took the reins. They rode through the desert night, the horse picking its way carefully over the rocky ground. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid warmth of her rescuer behind her. She had no idea where he was taking her, but for the first time in days, she wasn't afraid. When she next became fully aware, orange firelight was dancing on canyon walls. The Apache had built a small fire in a sheltered alcove between two towering rocks. She was lying on a soft blanket, and she could smell something cooking: rabbit, perhaps, or some other small game. He brought her more water and some kind of flatbread made from ground seeds. The food was simple, but tasted better than any meal she could remember. As her strength slowly returned, Sarah tried to communicate with her rescuer. She pointed to herself and said, "Sarah." He nodded and touched his chest, saying something that sounded like Nolnish. She tried to explain about John again, acting out his fever and pointing in the direction of their broken wagon. Nolnish listened carefully, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he spoke a few words in his own language and nodded toward the fire. Sarah understood that he was telling her they would rest here tonight and deal with her husband tomorrow. She should have been more worried about John, more frightened about her own situation. Something about this Apache warrior's calm presence made her feel safer than she had in weeks. As the fire died down to glowing embers, Sarah wrapped herself in the blanket Nolnish had given her and looked up at the countless stars overhead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, but tonight, for the first time since leaving Missouri, she was not alone in the vast wilderness. Sarah woke before dawn to find Nolnish already preparing for the day. He had packed their few belongings and was checking his horse's hooves with practiced efficiency. The fire had been carefully extinguished, leaving no trace of their presence, except some disturbed sand. When he saw her stirring, Nolnish brought her more water and dried meat. The food was tough and salty, but it gave her strength. Through gestures in his limited English, he made her understand that they were going to find John. Sarah felt a mixture of hope and dread. Would her husband still be alive after another night in the desert? They rode hard through the morning, Nolnish somehow tracking their way back across the seemingly trackless desert. Sarah marveled at how he read the land like an open book, noting broken twigs, displaced stones, and other signs invisible to her eyes. He would occasionally stop, dismount, and examine the ground closely before choosing their direction. The sun climbed higher. Sarah began to recognize landmarks from her desperate flight the day before. There was the distinctive red boulder, shaped like a sleeping giant. There was the dry creek bed lined with skeletal trees. Her heart pounded as they drew closer to where she had left John. When they crested a low ridge, Sarah saw their wagon in the distance. But something was wrong. Smoke was rising from their camp, and she could hear voices, many voices. Her blood ran cold as she realized what had happened. Other travelers had found their wagon and were probably looting their supplies. Nadas pulled his horse to a stop and studied the scene below. Sarah counted at least 6 men moving around their wagon, and she could see they had horses and pack mules. They didn't look like rescuers. They looked like the kind of rough men who preyed on stranded travelers. "John," Sarah whispered, trying to see if her husband was still alive under their makeshift shelter. One of the men was poking at the canvas with a stick, laughing at something his companion said. Sarah's heart sank as she realized these weren't good Samaritans. Nolnish spoke quietly in Apache, as if talking to himself. Then he looked at Sarah with serious eyes. "Bad men," he said in English. "Take things. Hurt man, maybe." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. It had come so far, and now John might be dead or dying while strangers stole everything they owned. She looked at Nolnish desperately. "Please," she said.
"Help him."
The Apache warrior was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks. He was 1 man against 6, and getting involved would certainly bring trouble. Sarah held her breath, knowing she had no right to ask this of him. He owed her nothing, and helping her further could endanger his own life. But then Nolnish did something unexpected. He reached for his rifle and checked the ammunition. His face had taken on a hard expression that made Sarah both grateful and afraid. Whatever he was planning, it would be dangerous. He gave Sarah specific instructions, speaking slowly so she would understand. She was to stay hidden with the horse while he went down to the wagon. If something went wrong, she was to ride north until she found water, then followed the stream east to find his people. The instructions terrified her because they suggested he might not survive. What he was about to do, Nolnish disappeared over the ridge as silently as a shadow. Sarah waited, every minute feeling like an hour, straining her ears for any sound. The desert was unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. Then she heard shouting from the direction of the wagon. Male voices raised in alarm and anger. Gunshot rang out, then another. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she imagined the worst. Had Nolnish been killed trying to help her husband? The gunfire stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. Sarah waited as instructed, but every instinct screamed at her to run toward the wagon and see what had happened. Minutes crawled by like hours. A vulture circled overhead, and Sarah took it as a bad omen. Finally, she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Multiple horses were coming toward her hiding spot. Sarah pressed herself lower behind the rocks, terrified that the rough men had killed Nolnish and were now hunting for her. But the voice that called out was familiar. "Sarah," Nolnish said quietly. "Safe now." She looked over the ridge and saw an amazing sight. Nanish was leading the stranger's horses in a string behind him, and the men were nowhere to be seen. More importantly, she could see a figure wrapped in blankets lying across one of the horses. John, he was alive when Nolnish reached her. His explanation was simple. "Men gone," he said. "Run away. Take nothing." Sarah didn't ask how he had managed to drive off 6 armed men single-handedly. Some questions were better left unanswered. They made camp in a protected canyon several miles from the wagon site. John was unconscious but breathing. His fever had broken, and the snake bite on his leg, while still swollen, was no longer the angry red it had been. Nolnish examined the wound with surprising gentleness and produced a leather pouch containing various dried plants. He mixed some of the herbs with water to make a paste, which he applied to John's leg. Then he brewed tea from other plants and managed to get some of the liquid down John's throat. Sarah watched in fascination as this Apache warrior displayed knowledge that rivaled any doctor she had known. "Learn from grandmother," Nolnish explained when he saw her curious expression. "She'll know all plants. What heal, what harm." As evening fell, John stirred and opened his eyes for the first time in days. He was confused and weak, but clearly out of immediate danger. When he saw Nolnish sitting by their fire, John tried to reach for a gun that wasn't there. "No," Sarah said quickly, placing a restraining hand on her husband's arm. "He saved us. Both of us." John looked from his wife to the Apache warrior and back again, trying to understand what had happened during his fevered sleep. Sarah began to tell him the story, starting with her desperate walk into the desert and ending with their rescue from the rough men who had found their wagon. As she spoke, John's expression changed from suspicion to amazement to something approaching gratitude. He looked at Nolnish with new eyes, seeing not an enemy, but the man who had risked everything to help strangers. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Sarah woke to the sound of many horses approaching their hidden canyon camp. Nolnish was already on his feet, rifle in hand, but his posture wasn't defensive. Instead, he looked almost relieved. A group of Apache warriors appeared at the canyon entrance, their horses stepping carefully down the rocky slope. Sarah counted 8 men, all armed, all watching her and John with expressions that were impossible to read. Her heart raced as she helped her still weak husband sit up against a rock. The leader of the group was an older man with graying hair and scars marking his weathered face. He spoke rapidly to Nolnish in Apache, his voice carrying both authority and concern. Sarah caught her husband's worried expression and squeezed his hand reassuringly, though she felt far from calm herself. Nolnish responded to the older warrior with obvious respect, gesturing toward Sarah and John several times during his explanation. The conversation continued for several minutes while the white couple waited nervously, understanding nothing but sensing that their fate was being decided. Finally, the older Apache turned his attention to them. His English was better than Nolnish's, though still broken. "I am Cochise," he said simply. "This one," he nodded toward Nolnish, "is my son." Sarah felt her breath catch. She had heard the name Cochise whispered in fear around campfires and trading posts. He was said to be one of the most powerful Apache leaders, a man who could unite the scattered bands against their enemies. Yet here he stood, speaking calmly about family matters. "My son tells me you are lost," Cochise continued. "Your wagon broken. You have no food, no water, no way to continue. He studied John's pallor and the bandaged snake bite with knowing eyes. The desert is not forgiving to those who do not understand her ways. John found his voice, though it came out as a croak. "We're grateful for your son's help, sir. We mean no harm to you or your people. We're just trying to reach California." Cochise nodded slowly. "Many of your people pass through our land seeking the yellow metal. Most do not see us as anything but obstacles to remove." His dark eyes fixed on Sarah. "But Nolnish says this. Woman fought the desert alone to save her husband. Says she showed no fear when he found her, only concern for another. This speaks of strong spirit." One of the younger warriors spoke up, his words sharp with what sounded like disagreement. Cochise listened, then replied in a tone that brooked no argument. Sarah wished desperately that she could understand what they were discussing. But their lives clearly hung in the balance of this debate. Nolnish stepped forward and said something. That made the other warriors look at him with surprise. Whatever he had proposed seemed to shock them. Cochise raised his hand for silence and studied his son carefully. "What is your name, woman?" Cochise asked Sarah. "Sarah Mitchell, sir?" "This is my husband, John." "Sarah Mitchell," Cochise repeated, as if testing how the foreign words felt in his mouth. "Nolnish has made an unusual request. He asks that you and your husband be allowed to stay with our band until you are strong enough to continue your journey." Sarah felt John tense beside her. She knew what he was thinking, the same stories they had both heard about white captives, who disappeared into Apache camps never to be seen again. But looking at Nolnish's earnest face and remembering all he had already done for them, Sarah found herself trusting him in a way that surprised her. "We would be honored," she said before John could object, "and grateful for any kindness you might show us." John shot her a look that clearly said she was making a terrible mistake. But he was too weak to argue and too proud to contradict his wife in front of these men. Cochise spoke again with his warriors, and Sarah could sense the tension in their responses. Finally, he made what was obviously a decision. "You will come with us," he announced. "But understand this, you are guests, not prisoners. You will be treated with respect if you show respect. You will learn our ways if you wish to survive." Among us, the Apache band began breaking camp with efficient speed. Warmed, Sarah helped John onto one of the horses they had recovered from the rough men, while Nolnish secured their few remaining possessions. Within an hour, they were traveling deeper into the desert, following paths that only Apache eyes could see as they rode. Sarah found herself riding beside an Apache woman who had joined the group. She was perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes and graying hair braided with colorful beads. Despite the language barrier, she seemed to understand that Sarah needed reassurance about what lay ahead. The woman pointed to herself and said Desba, and pointed to Sarah with a questioning look. When Sarah gave her name, Desba repeated it several times, nodding approvingly when she could pronounce it correctly. She then began pointing to various objects around them, rocks, plants, animals, and giving their Apache names. Sarah realized she was being given her first lesson in survival. They traveled through a country that grew increasingly wild and beautiful. Red rock formations towered overhead like ancient cathedrals, and hidden springs provided precious water. In unexpected places, Sarah began to understand why the Apache fought so hard to protect this land. It wasn't just empty desert as she had thought, but a complex and living place that could provide everything needed for life if you knew its secrets. As the sun reached its peak, they stopped to rest in the shade of a massive boulder. Desba shared jerky and pine nut cakes with Sarah, showing her how to make the tough meat more palatable by soaking it in water. John was managing to stay upright on his horse, but Sarah could see he was struggling with both physical weakness. In fear of their situation, Nolnish appeared at her side during the rest stop, offering her a drink from his water skin. "Your husband fears," he said quietly. "Yes," Sarah admitted. "We've heard many stories about your people, not all of them kind. Your people tell stories about us too," Nolnish replied. "Not all true." He looked toward where John sat slumped against a rock, watched over by two Apache warriors who were doing their best to appear non-threatening. "Fear makes enemies. Understanding makes ... something else." Sarah pondered his words as they resumed their journey. She was beginning to see that everything she thought she knew about Apache people might need to be reconsidered. These weren't the savage monsters of frontier stories, but families trying to protect their way of life in an increasingly dangerous world. The Apache camp nestled in a hidden valley that Sarah would never have imagined existed in the harsh desert landscape. A spring bubbled up from underground, creating a small stream that supported cottonwood trees and patches of green grass. Wickiups made of brush and hide dotted the valley floor, and children's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. Sarah helped John down from his horse, amazed at the transformation in her surroundings. This wasn't the temporary war camp she had expected, but a place where families lived and thrived. Women tended cook fires while children played with dogs and baby goats. Old men sat in the shade, working on arrows and tools. It looked almost peaceful, if not for the armed warriors who watched every approach to the valley. Desba took charge of the white couple immediately, leading them to a small wickiup that had been prepared for their use. The dome-shaped structure was larger than Sarah had expected, with a fire pit in the center and comfortable sleeping areas arranged around the sides. Buffalo robes and woven blankets made it surprisingly cozy. "Rest," Desba said in careful English, then launched into Apache. While miming that John should lie down and sleep. Despite his continued nervousness, John's exhaustion won out, and he collapsed gratefully onto the soft bedding. Sarah found herself reluctant to rest. Everything around her was so fascinating and different from her own world. Apache women moved about their daily tasks with quiet efficiency, and several smiled at her curiously. Children peeked around their mothers' skirts to stare at the strange white woman with fascinated eyes. Nolnish appeared at the entrance to their shelter as the afternoon sun began to slant through the canyon. "Come," he said simply. "Learn." Looked back at her sleeping husband, then followed Nolnish into the heart of the camp. He took her first to where his grandmother, an ancient woman with hands like gnarled roots, was preparing medicines from various plants. The old woman examined Sarah with bright, intelligent eyes and spoke rapidly to Nolnish. "She says you have strong spirit but weak body." Nolnish translated, "Desert almost killed you, but you survived. Now must learn to live with desert, not fight it." The grandmother, whose name was Ishkane, began showing Sarah different plants and their uses. Some were for healing wounds, others for stomach problems, still others for giving strength during long journeys. Sarah tried to memorize everything, realizing this knowledge might mean the difference between life and death in this harsh land. As evening approached, the entire camp gathered for the meal. Sarah was surprised to find herself and John seated in places of honor near Cochus's fire. The food was simple but delicious: rabbit stew, corn cakes, and a sweet drink made from cactus fruit. John ate hesitantly at first, but his hunger eventually overcame his suspicions. After the meal, one of the younger warriors began telling a story in Apache. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, she was captivated by his dramatic gestures and the way his voice rose and fell with the tale's excitement. The listeners responded with gasps and laughter at appropriate moments, and Sarah found herself caught up in the communal experience despite the language barrier. When the storyteller finished, Cochise spoke to Sarah directly. "He tells the story of Coyote and the Star Maiden," he explained. "Coyote sees beautiful woman in the sky and climbs mountain to reach her, but when he gets close, she moves farther away. Coyote learns that some things are meant to be admired from distance, not possessed." Sarah sensed there was a deeper meaning to the story, perhaps related to her own situation, but she didn't press for clarification. Instead, she thanked Cochise for the translation and expressed her gratitude for their hospitality. Over the following days, Sarah fell into the rhythm of Apache life. She helped the women gather plants and prepare food, learning which desert vegetation was edible and which was poisonous. She watched in fascination as they turned cactus pads into nutritious meals and made thread from yucca fibers. John recovered his strength more slowly, both physically and emotionally. The snake venom had taken a serious toll on his body, and his fear of their hosts made him reluctant to participate in camp activities. He spent most of his time sitting in the shade near their wickiup, watching everything with suspicious eyes. One Morning, Sarah woke to find John gone from their shelter. Panic seized her as she imagined him trying to escape and being hunted down by Apache warriors. She ran through the camp looking for him, her heart pounding with fear. She found him by the spring, sitting alone and staring at the water. His face was wet with tears he had tried to hide. Sarah sat beside him quietly, waiting for him to speak. "I keep thinking about those men," John said finally. "The ones who found our wagon. What they might have done to you if—" Ow. He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah took his hand, but they didn't. "Nalnish saved us both." "That's what I don't understand," John said, his voice full of confusion and shame. "Everything I was taught about Indians, everything I believed, none of it makes sense anymore. These people should be our enemies, but they're treating us better than our own kind did." Why Sarah had been struggling with the same realization. Apache people she was living among bore no resemblance to the savage monsters described in newspapers and dime novels. They were families with the same hopes and fears as any other families. They loved their children, cared for their elders, and worked hard to survive in a difficult world. "Maybe," Sarah said carefully, "the stories we heard weren't the whole truth." That afternoon, Nalnish approached Sarah while she was helping Desba weave baskets from willow shoots. "Your husband troubles his spirit," he observed. Sarah nodded. "He's trying to understand." "We both are." "Understanding comes slow," Nalnish said, like learning to read desert signs. "First, everything looks same, just rocks and thorns. Then slowly you see differences. This plant means water nearby. That rock formation means shelter from wind. These tracks mean food or danger." He sat down beside her and picked up a partially completed basket. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy as he added new strips of willow to the weaving. "My people have story," he continued. "Two men lost in desert. Right, one fights everything, curses sun, throws rocks at thorns, screams at sky, dies angry and alone. Other man watches, learns, adapts. Finds food in strange places, shelter in unexpected ways, lives to find his people again." Sarah understood the message. "You're saying we need to stop fighting what we don't understand and start learning from it." "Maybe," Nalnish said with a small smile. "Or maybe just good story for passing time while making baskets." That evening, John surprised everyone by joining the men around their fire. He couldn't understand their language, but he watched as they worked on weapons and tools, occasionally asking questions through gestures. One of the younger warriors, seeing John's interest in his bow, offered to show him how it was made. For the first time since arriving in the Apache camp, Sarah saw her husband genuinely smile. 3 weeks had passed when the scouts brought troubling news. Sarah was grinding corn with the other women when she noticed the sudden tension that fell over the camp. Warriors began checking their weapons, and mothers called their children. Closer to the wickiups, Cochise emerged from his lodge and spoke sharply to the scouts who had just returned. Their report was clearly serious, and Sarah felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. She had grown comfortable in this peaceful valley, but she was suddenly reminded that they were living in the middle of a war. Nalnish appeared at her side, his face grim. "Soldiers coming," he said quietly. "It's maybe 2 days' travel. Many soldiers with big guns." Sarah's hands stilled on the grinding stone. "Are they looking for us? Maybe looking for my people. Does not matter. When soldiers come to Apache land, trouble follows." The camp transformed within hours. The peaceful family atmosphere vanished, replaced by urgent preparations for either flight or fight. Women began packing essential supplies while men prepared weapons and scouted escape routes. Sarah realized she was witnessing something few white people ever saw: Apache warriors preparing for battle on their own terms. John found Sarah as she was helping Desba pack medicinal herbs. His face was pale but determined. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "If there are soldiers coming, we need to get to them before... ... "Before what?" Sarah asked, though she already knew what he was thinking. "Before they attack the camp and find us here," John said. "Sarah, if those soldiers think we've been collaborating with hostile Indians... ... Sarah looked around at the people. who had become her friends over the past weeks. Kenny, who had taught her to identify healing plants. The young mother who had shared her baby's first steps with Sarah just days earlier. The children who had overcome their shyness and now ran to greet her each morning. "These people saved our lives," she said quietly. "I know that," John replied. "But the soldiers won't care. They'll see us as traitors or hostages. Either way, it won't end well for anyone." Koshis approached them as they were discussing their options. "You must choose now," he said without preamble. "Stay with us and share whatever comes, or leave. While there is still time to reach the soldiers safely." It was the moment Sarah had been dreading. Over the weeks, she had come to see the Apache camp as more than just temporary shelter. These people had given her and John not just their lives, but a glimpse into a different way of living, one based on cooperation and respect for the natural world. "What will you do?" Sarah asked Cochise. The Apache leader was quiet for a moment, watching his people prepare for an uncertain future. "We will move deeper into the mountains where soldiers cannot follow easily. Some will want to fight, but fighting brings only more soldiers and more death for our families." "And Nolnish?" Sarah asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. "My son chooses his own path," Cochise replied, "as you must choose yours." That evening, the camp held what Sarah realized might be its last peaceful gathering. The usual storytelling and laughter were subdued, replaced by quiet conversations and meaningful glances. Sarah noticed that many people made a point of speaking to her and John, as if saying goodbye without words. Nolnish sat beside Sarah as the fire died down to embers. "Tomorrow you go," he said. It wasn't a question. "I think we have to," Sarah replied, hating the words even as she spoke them. "John is right about the danger. If those soldiers find us here, they find you anywhere in Apache land. Same danger," Nolnish pointed out. "But I understand. Your people, your choice." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last flames flicker in the fire pit. Sarah tried to memorize everything about this moment: the smell of sage smoke, the sound of night birds calling, the feeling of safety despite the approaching danger. "I want you to know," Sarah said finally, "that these weeks have changed everything for me. Everything I thought I knew about your people, about this land, about what it means to be truly alive. It was all wrong." Nolnish nodded slowly. "For me also. I thought all white people were like the soldiers and the men who steal our land. But you and your husband showed me different truths. Maybe there is hope for understanding between our peoples." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, though she wasn't sure she believed it. The hatred and misunderstanding seemed too deep. The differences too great. The next morning dawned gray and windy, matching Sarah's mood. The Apache were already breaking camp when she and John emerged from their wickiup. The organized chaos was impressive. Within 2 hours, the entire village would be packed and ready to move. Desba came to Sarah with a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside were carefully selected herbs and plant medicines, along with detailed instructions and pictures showing how to prepare and use each one. It was a gift more valuable than gold in this harsh land. Ish-K-Nay shuffled over and pressed something into Sarah's hands, a small medicine bag made from beautifully worked leather and decorated with tiny beads. Through Nolnish, she explained that it contained protective herbs and would bring good fortune on long journeys. But the hardest goodbye was with Nolnish himself. They stood facing each other in the early morning light, both struggling with words that seemed inadequate for the moment. "Maybe our paths cross again someday," Nolnish said finally. "I hope so," Sarah replied, meaning it more than she had ever meant anything. Nolnish helped her onto one of the horses, then lifted John up behind her. John was strong enough now to ride alone, but the double mount would be faster if they needed to escape danger quickly. "Remember," Nolnish said as he handed Sarah the reins, "desert is not enemy, is teacher. Listen to what it tells you." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Then she and John were riding away from the hidden valley, following a trail that would take them toward the approaching soldiers and back to their own world. As they crested the first ridge, Sarah looked back one last time. The Apache camp was already disappearing as if it had never existed, leaving only wind-blown sand and scattered rocks. But Sarah knew she would carry the memory of this place and these people with her forever. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked John as they rode through the morning heat. John was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But I know we're alive because of them, and that has to count for something." Ahead of them, dust clouds on the horizon marked the approach of the cavalry patrol that would return them to civilization. Behind them, the Apache band melted into the desert like smoke, carrying their ancient wisdom and their uncertain future into the wilderness that had always been their home. 2 years had passed since Sarah and John reached California, but the memories of their time with the Apache remained as vivid as yesterday. They had found modest success in the gold fields near Sacramento, enough to build a small cabin and start a general store serving other prospectors and settlers. Life was comfortable, predictable, safe, everything they had dreamed of when they first left Missouri. But Sarah often found herself staring west toward the desert, wondering what had become of Nolnish and his people. The newspapers carried frequent reports of Apache raids and military campaigns, each story making her heart ache with worry and frustration. The Apache she read about in these accounts bore no resemblance to the families who had saved their lives and opened their hearts. One autumn evening, as Sarah was closing the store, a travel-worn stranger approached her door. He was a grizzled mountain man with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's harsh realities. He carried news from the Arizona territory that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Terrible business down south," he told her and John over coffee. "Army finally cornered that band of Cochis's people. Whole camp wiped out, they say. Men, women, children, didn't matter to them soldiers. Said they was tired of chasing ghosts through them canyons." Sarah's cup slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the wooden floor. John reached for her hand as the stranger continued his grim report, unaware of the devastation his words were causing. "Found some interesting things in that camp, though," the man went on. "Army boys said there was signs that white folks had been living there. Women's clothes, man's boots, things like that. Command figured they was captives who got killed when the fighting started, but some of the scouts wasn't so sure." Sarah fled to their bedroom, unable to listen to any more. She pressed her face into her pillow to muffle the sobs that tore from her chest. Desba, with her kind smile and patient teaching, Kene, whose ancient wisdom had kept her people alive for generations. The children who had laughed and played around the cook fires, all gone. John found her there an hour later, still weeping for people whose names he could never speak aloud to anyone but his wife. He held her close, sharing her grief for the family they had found and lost in the desert. "Maybe the story isn't true," he whispered. "You know how these tales grow in the telling? Maybe they escaped into the deep desert where the soldiers couldn't follow." But 3 days later, an official army dispatch arrived that shattered even that fragile hope. Among the Apache dead, the report noted, was a warrior identified by scouts as Nolnish, son of the notorious Chief Cochise. He had been found defending the camp's rear guard, apparently buying time for others to escape. Sarah felt something break inside her chest. The man who had risked everything to save 2 strangers, who had carried her to safety when she was dying of thirst, who had shown her that understanding could bridge any gap between peoples, he was gone. The world suddenly seemed a darker, smaller place without his quiet presence in it. For weeks, Sarah could barely function. She went through the motions of daily life, serving customers and managing the store. But her heart remained in that hidden valley where she had learned what it meant to truly live. John watched her with growing concern, knowing that grief was consuming his wife from the inside. Then, on a cold December morning, everything changed again. Sarah was sweeping the store's front porch when she noticed a lone rider approaching from the south. There was something familiar about the way he sat his horse, the proud set of his shoulders, the unhurried pace despite the winter wind. Her heart began to pound with impossible hope. The rider came closer, and Sarah saw features she had memorized during those precious weeks in the Apache camp, older now, marked by hardship and loss, but unmistakably alive. Nolnish had somehow survived the massacre that claimed his people. He dismounted slowly, as if uncertain of his welcome, and stood looking at her across the dusty street. Sarah dropped her broom and ran to him, propriety forgotten in the overwhelming relief of seeing him alive. "You're supposed to be dead," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Army thinks so," Nolnish replied, his English noticeably improved. "Sometimes being thought dead is a useful thing." John appeared in the doorway, his face cycling through surprise, joy, and concern as he realized what this meant. If anyone recognized Nolnish, if word got out that they were harboring an Apache warrior, thought killed in battle, the consequences could be terrible. But looking at his wife's radiant face, John made the same choice he had made in that desert canyon 2 years ago. He stepped forward and offered his hand to the man who had saved their lives. "Welcome," he said simply. "You'll always be welcome here." Over the following days, Nolnish told them what had happened. The attack had come at dawn, just as the scouts had warned. Most of the band had escaped into the deep canyons, but the soldiers had caught the rear guard. In the confusion of battle, Nolnish had been wounded and left for dead among the other bodies. He had survived by remaining still until the soldiers moved on, then crawled away to recover in a hidden cave. "Cochise lives," he told them. "Many others too, but scattered now, afraid to come together. Hard to be Apachean world that once is gone." Sarah noticed he didn't mention Desba or Ishkane, and she didn't ask. Some losses were too fresh to discuss. The question of what to do now hung unspoken between them. Nolnish couldn't stay in Sacramento without risking exposure, and returning to Arizona meant living as a fugitive in his own homeland. But Sarah had an idea that had been growing in her mind since his arrival. "Come north with us," she said that evening as they sat by the fire. "Oregon Territory is opening up, new settlements, new chances. A man could start over there, maybe even find others who want to live in peace." Nolnish was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. Finally, he looked up at Sarah and John with something like hope in his dark eyes. "You would do this? Leave good life here to help Apache warrior who brings nothing but danger?" "Not just an Apache warrior," Sarah said firmly. "Your family. You're the man who taught me that the desert isn't an enemy, but a teacher. Who showed me that understanding can exist between any people who choose to seek it." 6 months later, the three of them stood on a hill overlooking the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Below them, green forests stretched to distant mountains, and a clear river wound through meadows that seemed to promise endless possibilities. They had traveled as the Mitchell family, with Nolnish as Sarah's brother who had been living in Mexico. It wasn't entirely a lie in every way that mattered. They were family now. Good land, Nolnish said, breathing deeply of the pine-scented air. Good place for new beginnings. Sarah smiled, thinking of the medicine bag Ishkane had given her, now carefully packed among their belongings. The old woman had said it would bring good fortune on long journeys. Perhaps the longest journey of all was learning to see past the surface differences to the human hearts that beat the same rhythm in all people. As they began their descent into the valley, Sarah felt a deep peace settle over her. They had been lost once, all of them in different ways. But sometimes being lost was the only way to find what you were truly searching for. In saving each other, they had discovered something more valuable than gold. They had found their way home.